Okay, here's the edited version of the text, focusing on the horror stories and removing the intro, outro, and unrelated content. Story 1. On June 26th of this year, something happened to me that has cost me long nights of sleep. It has to do with a paranormal event that I witnessed in Mexico last year. I had a beautiful relationship with a young woman who lives in Villacuapa, Mexico City. One day I went with my partner to her sister's wedding, without knowing what was waiting for us and would chase us for the rest of our lives. The whole celebration went normally. When night came, I offered to take her and her sister back home. It was more or less 1 in the morning. We were on our way, when, climbing the bridge, my sister-in-law tells us that in the lake there was a woman crouched. With concern, I looked back at the path and told her to stop seeing her because it was incorrect and could hurt us. Taking my suggestion, my sister-in-law turned her gaze to the front, but doing so unknowingly made us stop. She turned back, seeing how the woman became a ball of fire that vanished between the trees. When we arrived, her mother asked us what had happened, since she had a pale look and trembled with fear. Once we told my in-laws, they revealed a more macabre story than what we had just witnessed. They said that in that place there was always one or several babies with bite marks and no blood in their bodies. When I took my things to go, my girlfriend's father suggested that I stay, since that creature had smelled me and it was possible that something bad happened to me. I ended up acceding his proposal, feeling how the fear ran through my bones. As time went by, my girlfriend and I began to have problems and we separated. I got a job opportunity here in France and moved recently. I never imagined I could find myself again with that witch. And much less so many kilometers away. On June 26th, I found myself walking through the gardens of the Eiffel Tower when the memory of my ex-girlfriend came to my mind. I know that for one of her friends she has not been well and her family has had many problems at all levels. While I was thinking, I stumbled upon an old woman with a lot of pain. When I apologized for pushing her, it was not her smell that disconcerted me, but rather it was the response she gave me at that moment. When she looked at me, she answered that it was not the first time we saw each other. She said she remembered that night at the lake in Xochimilco. No word came out of my mouth, and with a crooked and dirty smile she walked away from me. Since that night I have not been able to sleep well. I feel like something is resting on my body. When dawn breaks I see scratches on my legs and also on my back. I feel like I'm being watched and I can't walk peacefully anywhere. These have been very stormy months. Even when trying to write this story, something mysterious prevented it. My charger burned and its short circuit does not plug in and I could not get my laptop. Despite having left it where it always was, I hope I can soon sleep and stop spending the nights on a candle. One of my friends in Mexico told me that my vacation was to Veracruz, since one of his days is dedicated to cleaning this type of energy. When I make the trip, I know what is happening, but I can tell you how I got out of that exhausting situation. Because all I'm looking for is to go back to sleep peacefully. Story 2. Tepoztlan is a town called Magic Town for its architecture, churches and museums. It is a place with a Jesuit past like Chupasado, where the Franciscan order came to found aqueducts. All of these are surrounded by large hills and forests like Villa del Carbon. My grandmother's house is on the asphalt of the hill, and at night we can clearly see the fireballs dancing among themselves, creating circles in the hills of the hill and on the top of the hill. Every night we saw that strange phenomenon without knowing what it was really about. Until one night in the room that I was sleeping in I heard something falling from the sky. It was like an iron ball that bounced off the roof. I was losing strength until it ended up rotating around the room. Once it stopped sounding, I ran to wake up my mother, but she always told me that she didn't hear anything. That I was simply imagining it and that I should go to sleep again. That sound became my personal nightmare. Every morning while I was sleeping I was awakened by that dry blow. Then the presence of something rolling, and the worst part is that no one else heard it, making me feel more scared. There was no shortage of nights when two of my aunts would sleep in the same bedroom. They heard the sound and confirmed what I lived every morning. But that was not the only thing that announced the existence of a strange presence outside the house. In other rooms, we could hear the sound of ribs on the roof. But every time we went up to check, we found absolutely nothing. But it was one night when we obtained the last test we needed to verify our suspicions. In the morning, my grandmother heard how something heavy was falling the sheets of her room. Full of fear and frightened by the sound, she took her sweater and climbed quickly to see what it was. There she found a scene that gave her a chill throughout her body. Above the house was the neighbor crouched, stripping of all clothes. Today we do not understand what happened that night really. We have not been able to give a logic to these paranormal activities, but everything points to what has to do with being the so-called witches. Story 3. My story begins between 2003 and 2004. My cousins lived in a 3-story house and I was going to visit that place. It was spacious and there were many rooms where we could play. 2 years after having lived, they moved from that house, and when I asked them the reason, they told me that paranormal activities were happening inside. They told me that at night I heard as if several people were running around the roof. The kitchen things also broke, and on the stairs that were on the 2nd floor I heard someone climb the stairs with heavy boats with chains. For years I remained curious about what really happened in that place. Until when I turned 12, my family members moved to the mysterious property again. For that reason I decided to stay a few nights to check what they had lived. When I went to visit them, I noticed that only the 1st floor was occupied, because they said that most of the events took place on the 2nd floor. My childish curiosity made me suggest to my cousins to sleep on the 2nd floor, and so we did. The first nights went by quietly, but when I came back a few months later I heard cries and footsteps. Also, a door that closed from the inside was always open from side to side. At first we didn't take it seriously because we thought it could be any sudden sound. Until one night while we were sleeping we heard heavy metals falling, waking us up immediately. We got up and saw it was 3 a.m. The sound of the metals in the attic lasted approximately 2 hours without letting us sleep. We continued to witness more appearances. I remember that on one occasion I was paralyzed when I looked at an unknown old man climbing the stairs. The spectrum did not turn to look at me because I was peering through the blankets. But when I told my cousins the next morning, one of them confessed to having seen a woman in white who was looking out towards the window of the bedroom where we slept. We knew immediately that that woman was responsible for the heels that sometimes heard through the halls. One of the stories about the house was that on one occasion a corpse was buried under the floor, and that there were probably more like these. After that incident, my aunt took a father from the church and the man did not want to enter the property. He said that in it he felt a fairly malignant force. All of that made me think a lot and I couldn't get that house out of my mind. Days passed and I stayed again, but that night was the most terrifying and scary night of all. That day we were quiet watching TV when at 9 at night we heard some very loud footsteps climbing the stairs. My cousin and I lowered the sound of the program and listened to the 2nd floor door open. Then you walked to the roof with those annoying steps. After a few minutes, the whole house was in total silence. Until they began to hear some big stones rolling around the house. My aunt and the rest of my cousins knew what was going on. When they realized that it wasn't us, they were scared to know that there was no one in the roof. We wanted to go upstairs to see, but an air current didn't let us through the door. When we looked outside, there was a thick fog that covered everything and we couldn't define what was happening. We had to go back to the 1st floor. The noises continued all night. Although the street wasn't making noise or fog, in the lower part, my uncle had a workshop and the appliances he used were turned on by themselves at night. Or they were also found in a different place, and my aunt used to think that place was full of souls without rest, since when one of my cousins was 6 years old he spent hours talking to someone in the bathroom. Although he was practically alone, my cousins told me that the paranormal events did not stop happening and decided to move again. For my part, the one from this traumatic experience continues to have nightmares with the house, but I'm still curious to know what's really there. According to the investigations I've done, I discovered that that property was one of the first in the town. So probably the remains they found were perhaps from one of the first owners, since before they used to bury people in their land. Another thing that is rumored about the neighborhood is that there are witches nearby. However, I have not confirmed anything of all this, but my curiosity tells me that in addition to spirits there must also be demons and other paranormal entities. The nightmares I still have make me feel that I must stay there for a few days to find out what is really happening, and thus get out of doubts once and for all. Story 4. I have had all my life encounters and terrifying experiences with witches. This is because my family maintains an energetic heritage full of curative and premonitory gifts. Since my childhood, I have been mentioned to have an intense energy desired by dark beings. My first encounter with this type of entity occurred at the age of 3 years, when I still did not even have a reason to use it. Although I don't remember the event, the story has been told for many years within the family. They assure that I was close to being kidnapped by a terrifying creature. It happened one day while all the young people in the family were playing in the yard. Out of nowhere, a bird of abnormal proportions appeared that imitated the height of a human person. The creature stopped in front of me and ended up watching me for a long time. My cousins and brothers assured me that the bird had human features on its face. It was as if it were an anthropomorphic animal. I was hypnotized by watching the animal and began to approach it. Meanwhile, the creature opened its giant wings to grab me when it was close. My family reacted and began to throw stones at it, screaming. One of my older cousins prayed to the bird and threw a crucifix at him, causing that strange animal to stop concentrating on me to look at them. I stopped my walk and the creature approached to attack my cousins. But luckily the neighbors left and everyone began to haunt the bird with prayers and sounds. My family took the opportunity to cover me and enter the house as far as possible from that creature. Time passed and I did not have any more paranormal type inconvenience. Until I turned 11, when I experienced one of the worst moments I remember with chills. For those weeks I had been having severe stomach problems. I got up in a hurry to go to the bathroom at about 3 in the morning. I was at my grandparents' house and the bathroom was directly a dark alley from the neighborhood house complex. When I entered I heard the sound of some faces scratching the wooden door. Something inside me knew what was happening, but I tried to ignore it. When I left, the noise intensified and I looked to see where I was coming from, only to find the bones of a hand with its long and skinny fingers that called me with a gesture. Terrified, I ran to my parents' room, and when I lay down on the bed I observed on the ceiling, there was the face of a horrendous being, like that of an animal mixed with that of a human. This was laughing in a macabre way. A scream escaped from my chest, waking up my parents, who I told to protect me because they knew they were there and were coming for me. Fear paralyzed me and my parents asked me where I was seeing them. When I pointed up, they just felt it and covered me until I fell asleep. After that traumatic experience I grew up being more cautious about what I heard and could see. But at 18 years of age, when my nephew was born, the situation was impotent. The birth of the baby brought us all a lot of joy in the family. However, my nephew cried with great strength during the night. Every night between 2 and 1 he would wake up unable to stop crying. I suspected it could be because of the witches, so for a while I took the opportunity to do the whole task during the night and I was at his side calming him. I kept that routine for 7 long months until he was baptized. But the horror did not end and the baby cried every night, waking up the neighbors. The strangest thing is that no one in the family could hear it. My mother explained to me that she heard him, and when she tried to get up she couldn't. She said she felt like a sleep paralysis. The nights of crying stopped happening, but something strange happened when I accompanied my mother to visit a man who handles the issue of curations. I stayed outside waiting for her to finish the session, when I suddenly felt a very heavy look on my back. When I returned, I observed a man standing a few meters away from me who approached him with a slow pace. I didn't pay attention to him because I assumed he also had a date with the curator. But it was my surprise when that man told me that I was the light that had not allowed them to approach the baby. Strangely, by his words, I asked him if he was talking to me, to which this person replied that I was the light. I asked him to stop talking to me, and he told me that he had gaze, and that if I decided to enter that world I would become an obstacle for them, and he would not allow that to happen. I was not afraid of his threats, and in that instant my mother came out asking who he was talking to, since that man I had seen was not there. Although I told my mother that it did not mean anything, I still remember at the foot of the letter the words he told me. And one thing I will never be able to forget will be his face. This one is well kept in my memory. Story 5. The story that I am going to tell you next is one of the strangest events that I have experienced in my life. And it is also one that marked the entire community where it happened. Here in Nicaragua, it is common for witches to become animals and monsters to attack or annoy their enemies. With this background, I must say that when I was a child, my family and I lived in a humble and small community. Most of the land was uninhabited and had let a lot of vegetation grow. It was impossible to observe inside the mounds. There was a rumor that our neighbor was keeping a relationship with a man who sold tamales with strange substances and witchcraft. One night, around 10, I was in the patio and heard a noise near the entrance to the house. I decided to look out, and I could see how my neighbor went out with Miltario towards the house of that strange man. At that moment, I did not pay attention to him, but since our neighbor announced his friendship, strange events began to happen in the house. For example, the fence of poles that divided his land from ours moved intensely. Elton that he was not hitting the breeze or seeing someone nearby. At night it was heard as if something scratched the metallic division with long and pungent claws, in such a way that it produced a torrential sound. His house was alone most of the time. Our neighbor went out to work from very early and returned very early at night, but during his absence, noises were always heard inside the property. They could also see lights that went out and turned on even though there was no one inside. From one day to the next, the woman befriended the man who presumed to be a witch and stopped visiting him. From that moment on, in our line of cases, a large animal with a simian appearance began to be seen. It was the size of an average adult and was seen all over the patios. There were many people who saw that beast and also many who were attacked by it. One afternoon, when the sun was just hiding, my younger sister was getting the chickens. The corral was located next to the fence that divided us from the house next door. Once she finished her work, my sister went to wash her hands, and when she heard suddenly how they were calling her with a ceasefire. When she turned, she screamed, horrified at seeing a monkey with bright eyes peeking from the other side. We all went to her meeting and found her crying from fear as she told us what had happened. I confess that on my part one felt the atmosphere very tense, as if there was no air in the place. I filled myself with courage and ended up approaching the fence to light the dark patio of the neighbor. But I couldn't find anything besides a large, blunt tree where the light of my flashlight couldn't reach. The vegetation seemed suspicious to me because of the rumors that the monkey was raiding the houses. And after what happened to my sister, I checked my concerns about what it was or was living there. Another person from the neighborhood who suffered an attack by the scaring animal was the sister of a neighbor who lived 3 houses from ours. The young woman told us that while he was in his patio he heard a rumble in his henhouse, and when he looked up he saw in the darkness an animal covered in titanic proportions. He was staring at her eyes and the woman could not see him completely. She could only see the fingers of his long legs that were sinking to the ground. When he tried to move, he felt as if the beast had his neck pressed between his claws. All the neighbors were terrified. But no one knew what to do to stop those attacks. Until one fateful night, our neighbor came home early, and after dinner she lay down to sleep, turning off all the lights. At dawn, from our rooms we heard some footsteps on the roof that ran from one side to the other. We all knew it was the animal that had been chasing us, and we heard how it jumped to the neighbor's house, making a dry noise when it fell. It wasn't long after that a screaming came from the continuous ceiling of the house, which ended up waking the whole community up. When we left, we saw that the roof of her house had a huge hole, and the woman came out with her body full of scratches and blood. She was screaming, very upset that she had hurt the girl. When we entered the patio, we discovered a cut hand full of hair, which began to slowly transform into a human. He was somehow trying to stop the bleeding. When he noticed that they were following him, the creature went into a tree. It was never known who the witch who had transformed into Mona was. The strange man with whom the neighbor had spoken, a half-naked, is related to the attacks. In his hand he was in perfect condition, so he could not be him. However, he left the town after several threats. When the neighbors entered the house, they found photos of the houses that had been looted, questioning the words he had said before leaving. The last strange thing I witnessed happened when I was lying in my bed watching the cell phone. It was 5:30 in the afternoon while my mother was preparing dinner. Suddenly, I turned my face to the window and saw a ball of fire that stopped suddenly. Scared, I called my mother, and the fire moved away at great speed from the tree where the witch of that day had tried to escape. When I told my family, no one believed me despite all the horror we had lived together. But I know what I saw. I maintain that there are many more hidden threats between us. So it will be better if you are very careful. Story 6. For more than 40 years, things have happened to me during childhood and adulthood. After listening to the stories of the channel, I can better understand the paranormal nature that they have, and I try to be more careful from now on. I'm from Puerto Rico, and since I was a kid I've seen witches, demons, spirits, inauspicious elves. In my hometown, people tend to be more skeptical about these topics, and there are those who say they are pure lies. But I know perfectly well that they are real, and right now I could be one near you, prowling your neighborhood or in your patio waiting for you to come out. This time I want to tell you the story of my family with these creatures and the origin that they pursue me. For this I must relate many years ago, even before my mother was born, in the time of my great-grandparents. My maternal grandmother used to tell me stories of the events of my family, which end up linking everyone at the same point. It all started with my great-grandfather, a very similar and respected man in his town. The guy married his partner when they were both very young. The alliance resulted in a fairly large family. One day my grandfather left the neighbor's farm because he needed pasture for his cow. It was a common activity since they were great friends, and they always allowed him to roam his land to feed his animal. That day it was very late and the night had already fallen, so he found himself in a silent darkness while he was walking. Suddenly the cow began to move unhurriedly, and my great-grandfather thought he could see someone at the exit. For this reason he began to walk to investigate, surprised to notice that although he had a good time walking, he did not reach the entrance. Confused, he continued to advance without achieving it, until he heard the voice of a woman who was calling him. A chill passed through his body as the female voice did not belong to any of his daughters or his wife. They called him again, and the full moon light shone with greater intensity, revealing in this way the figure of a woman in clothes climbing a tamarind tree. The creature incited him to let his family help her, promising him that they would make him the richest and luckiest man in the town. With a mollified tone, my grandfather denied the woman's insinuations and told him that he would never go out with a witch. The creature got upset and swore that he would never leave that mountain. After that, he disappeared before his own eyes. my great-grandfather spent the whole night walking without rest. He felt that if he slept, that witch would do something to him. When the first rays of the sun came out, he felt relieved to realize that he was still a few meters from the entrance. From that day, it did not pass again at night. And I have always noticed with doubt the tamarind tree in front of my house, from which all life has felt that they are watching me. The next story has to do with an experience that my grandfather lived in his youth. Like his father, my grandfather was a striking man. He was very similar, with clear eyes, and possessed the strength of 3 men together. All the women in the place were in love with him, but none was good enough before the eyes of my great-grandmother. One day, when I went up to the town, a young woman dressed in rags, somewhat mistreated and with green eyes, began to follow him to the house. When he arrived, his mother asked him who the girl was, and he only answered that he had been following her. Once they spoke to the young woman, she confessed that she wanted to become my grandfather's wife, which my great-grandmother accepted, concreting the marriage. My grandparents became a happy family, which is not liked by many women in the town. These full of envy, they went to the young woman's father to tell him where he was, since before leaving, my grandmother was treated like the maid of the house by her father, her stepmother and her half-brothers. This evil woman who had married her father was one of the most powerful witches in the area. And when she realized that my grandmother had escaped, she demanded her husband to look for her and take her back to the house. The man, hypnotized by the evil woman, came to my grandfather's house screaming at my grandmother to bring him back. His husband refused and my great-grandfather also confronted him. So scared and wanting to avoid a fight with those men, he simply retired with cowardice. They did not know more about my grandmother's father, but that witch along with another evil of the people out of envy decided to separate my grandparents. They did their jobs to make them discuss daily without fatigue. My great-grandparents noticed that this was certainly not normal. Puesto que la pareja no había discutido antes o estaban realmente enamorados. Cansados de la situación decidieron divorciarse pero fue justamente en ese momento que se enteraron que mi abuela estaba embarazada de mi madre. Todo volvió a la normalidad bajo el respeto y el amor que se tenían ambos. Mi madre nació sana siendo una niña hermosa de piel blanca como la nieve. Tenía un cabello negro y unos ojos preciosos heredados de sus padres. But after her birth, bad things began to happen again. One afternoon, while my grandmother boiled water to clean the house, she put my mother in a crib near her. She gave her back a second and suddenly heard the baby's cry from afar. When she turned, she noticed that her daughter was not where she had left her. She looked out the window, following the sound of the cry, and observed how my mother was lying on the ground with an old woman dressed in black next to her. That woman was laughing at her. Annoyed, my grandmother took the water and threw the unknown woman in the face. And despite her appearance, the old woman ran at great speed in the patio. She was screaming and cursing her walking. My grandmother raised her baby, observing that that witch had thrown her an antler and she was full of wounds. Some years passed until my mother and her siblings were born with many health problems. Over time, I have thought, my mother grew up to become a very solicited woman, since she had claimants wanting to marry her. But only my father managed to conquer them and they got married, becoming a very happy marriage. Unfortunately, my father's ex-partner was starting witchcraft by then, and wasn't happy that they had left her for my mother. The night of my parents' wedding, my grandparents returned to their absurd discussions and everything got worse again, until my mother gave the news that she was pregnant with me and everything subsided. When I was little, the neighbors in the neighborhood told me that there was a witch who swore that my grandfather would be hers at all costs. So, for my bad luck, I had 2 witches who wanted me to stop existing. On one occasion, my pregnant mother found herself in a family funeral and while she was distracted, the witch seemed obsessed with my father. She touched his belly, saying that he was very big while caressing him. Seeing that my mother did not believe any of that, she did not think it would be anything bad. But a few minutes later, I started to feel my stomach too hot. I had an acute pain and my aunts started to pray for her and I managed to get out of that traumatic episode. But unfortunately, the job was already done. The day of my birth, the doctor noticed that my position was not the right one. I was turned over and it was impossible to get out. My mother and I were about to lose our lives, so they decided to do a cesarean. When the doctor took me out, he had to contain a scream of horror when he found me with the umbilical cord tangled in the neck. I was lucky that this did not suffocate me, but the doctor assured my mother that my skull would be deformed and I would have a delay. Thank God, none of this happened. My head took its original form, leaving me only with a small deformity in my skull. In general terms, I grew up being a healthy child with outstanding grades in school. That is the origin of my Calvary, or just the beginning of a life full of encounters with other creatures. My father's ex ended up becoming one of the most powerful witches on the island, and finally managed to separate him from my mother. He still has the work he had on him, and I have suffered serious traumatic experiences, which have taken me little by little to madness and to doing the unthinkable. My name is Jean-Paul, and the story that I am going to tell you happened to me a long time ago when I was still residing in my hometown, Colombia. During my teenage years, my grandparents lived in a small ranch far from everyone else in the middle of nowhere, more precisely between the towns of Puerto Rico and Tierra Alta. The terrain had a humble house of a small size built, and on one side was the only communication road between the adjacent towns. The greatest advantage of this location was the tranquility of the silence and the ample space we had to play. However, the nearest house was approximately 9 kilometers away, so we remained unaccommodated most of the time. On vacation, my mother took my cousins and me to spend time in the countryside. We wanted to live new experiences, but they didn't know that what we lived there would change us forever. Being on the ranch, we met a large part of the family. There were my grandparents, my cousins, my aunts, my mother, and I. We were all happy to move away from the daily hustle and bustle of the city and relax together. But one night when the sun went down and the moon went up, our laughter turned into screams of horror. That afternoon we decided to have a party in the patio with my grandfather. All the cousins got together to sing and play a little music, like that of 12 at night, while my grandfather sang one of his favorite songs. We started to hear a cry coming from the road. Strangered by the peculiar sound and the time that was, we decided to approach to see if someone needed help. That sound increased with despair, and we thought it could be someone who had been hit in a dark place. Always alert, my grandfather took his shotgun and called Titan, his hunting dog guardian, who was trained to attack any danger. Without leaving, we walked down the street until we found the person responsible for that loud cry. In the middle of the road there was a little boy of approximately 8 years old who cried, hugging his legs while keeping his face hidden. The little boy's skin was completely white and luminous, making it stand out in the darkness of the night. We thought he might have had an accident with his parents, but there was no trace of anyone else around. As we did not find a sign of his family, my grandfather approached him cautiously to ask if he was okay. But the boy kept crying without answering. After a few seconds, my grandfather asked him the same question again. When he didn't get an answer, he clung to him enough to put his hand on the little boy's shoulder, making him turn. Leaving us frozen in the act when we saw that it was not a child. It was a spooky creature with a white demoniac face. Your eyes were black like coal, and his normal smile was full of fangs that peeped into his mouth. My grandfather moved away and the head of the lens began to grow as if it were inflating, releasing a gloomy smile that made us all run back home. When we entered, we closed all the doors while we processed what had just happened. Some of us cried and others lost their voice, but my grandfather always remained serious. He did not show any kind of fear or surprise, telling us that all that was the fault of the witches who lived nearby. After that occasion, everything returned to normal, and with time we forgot what happened. One night, while everyone was sleeping peacefully inside the house, we began to hear whistles in the surroundings. It was past 12 in the morning and everything was completely dark. The sound was acute and penetrating, making it impossible for us to reconcile the dream. When I asked my mother about what was that sound so loud, she answered that it was a witch. Surprised, I got closer to her because I didn't believe those stories were true. My mom tried to calm me down by saying that as long as we didn't go out, everything would be fine and that I would try to sleep again. But the noise was getting louder and louder and it was impossible to ignore it. Everyone began to wake up and my grandfather told us not to make noise and that no one should leave. The hours passed and the sound remained intense, tormenting our ears. It was then that a dry noise was heard in the patio of the house, as if something had fallen from the ceiling. We all listened to the instructions and no one left, fearing the great dark force that was outside. At some point the sound fell and we all could sleep again. The next day we could observe the ceiling of the patio destroyed on the floor. It was as if something had fallen with its weight, and when I removed the debris we found that the floor was burned. Although we never managed to know why, on that occasion we were saved and I began to believe in those evil beings that roamed in the towns and forests. But luck would last little when one day one of my cousins went to his friend's house to play football. As he was the oldest of us, he went alone and my grandparents warned him not to let the night fall on him, since a witch could appear to him on the way. He just made fun of them and said yes, if one of them disappeared, I would try to conquer him. That was laughing. The day passed and we had no news of my cousin. We all prepared to look for him. My grandfather took his gun, called his dog, and we started looking. We traveled the road until we saw the unconscious body of my cousin on one side of the road. We tried to wake him up, but he didn't react and we had to carry him loaded to the house. It was not until the next morning that he woke up and was able to tell us his story. He says that time passed while he was playing and he returned when it was already dark. When he came halfway through the path, he observed a large, completely dark creature that moved at great speed through the mountain. He tried to accelerate the step to get faster, but was intercepted by something that never saw his form. After that, he remembers that he woke up in the house without knowing what had happened. When he finished telling the story, my grandfather assured him that it was a witch who had appeared to him to make fun of them. Time passed and my older cousin began to have a rather strange attitude. He became an aggressive and non-talking person and only stayed with his gaze lost at a single point. We were all very worried about his behavior, and everything worsened when his mother died of a heart attack. A wise woman from the town whom my grandfather trusted attended the wake. When they told her the situation, the woman recommended that they leave my cousin locked up with the lifeless body of his mother, that this in some way would decrease the aggressiveness of the boy. They did what the woman told them and it worked. He stopped having a disturbing attitude, but he didn't do the same thing again. One afternoon he disappeared and we went to look for him and we found him in the same place where we had found him unconsciously. Unfortunately, it had been too late. We never knew what happened to him, but from what I can give you, the testimonies that in the space where we found him, there was a black circle around him where vegetation never grew again. And as I said, this whole event marked us forever. I've been living in a town for 12 years. Currently, I dedicate myself to lending my knowledge of gray magic to people who need help with witchcraft, exorcisms, and detection of spirits in properties. But it wasn't always like this. This whole story began when my parents changed me to high school. I found myself without knowing anyone in a new place and I had no friends. I practically spent most of the time alone. 3 days before starting classes, I sat in a seat close to the wall and watched a classmate. I was showing the teacher some bottles with a mysterious liquid inside. I asked the boy next to me about the curious young woman. He told me that she was an isolated girl from our class, with whom everyone avoided talking except with someone who has a wound, because when that happened she helped them with her magical bottles. I missed the direction the conversation went and he advised me to stay away from her, but I couldn't stop seeing her because she had a mysterious air that made me want to meet her. A week later, I found myself at home doing my homework. I decided to go for a walk in the park to clear my mind a little. That was the second opportunity I observed my classmate. I missed finding her in such a lonely place at the time of the night. So I walked in the same direction in case I needed help with something. I entered through a path that I had never traveled, and between trees and branches I observed it with lights around it, but because I walked without seeing the floor I fell scratching my foot, which generated an intense pain that made me lose consciousness. When I woke up, my partner was in front of me pouring her bottle of water into the bleeding wound. There I could see how the scar closed and disappeared immediately. I thanked her for helping me and asked her name, to which she replied that her name was Ellie. Surprised by my rapid recovery, I got up without any pain. Unbelievable that water was magical. What Ellie told me that it was not because she wanted to show me something. We reached a deep well in which she took out the water, but my surprise was greater when she began to pray to the Holy Death. There was also an image of a demon himself. Scared and full of curiosity, I asked her if that was witchcraft. To which she replied that it was black magic and that she was a witch. She told me that it started in that whole world since she was little, and that in that way it helped people. Seeing my interest in the subject, she gave me some books about black and white magic. The one I've been studying since then until today. Currently, I am recognized in the town for helping people with witchcraft. All the paranormal situations that I've experienced in my life occurred in my grandmother's house, to which we moved in 1997. At that time, I had just turned 10 years old, and the first warning that our stay in the place was going to become a real nightmare. It happened shortly before we moved. My parents, my brothers and I did the remodeling before taking our things. On one of those many visits when almost everything was finished, we arranged to go to our truck to return the next week. The house was uninhabited at the time, and my mother always took care of putting the lock on the fence before we left. That day, while she was doing it, I fixed my eyes on the light we had left on. There I could see how a person dressed in a long dark tunic walked from the kitchen to the room that would be my mother's. I didn't give her importance because I thought it was a confusion in my mind. But when we moved in, I understood that it was a warning of what was coming. Our stay at the house was 19 years old, and we experienced all kinds of paranormal events without explanations. I have always been susceptible to energies, and it was common to look with the corner of my eye at people who were not really there. But one morning, while I was in my room's computer, I saw a white cloth pass through the glass window that was the garden. At that moment, I thought it could be my mother, and I took my headphones off, waiting for her to come in. But it wasn't her, and I just heard them push the door a little. I tried to ignore what happened and continued with my affairs. When I suddenly felt again that something happened by the door when I turned and saw a white ball of smoke jumping through the bedroom. This thing jumped towards me, and I observed that it had a face of scratched and gray eyes. The smoke crossed me, and I was in a state of shock without understanding what had happened. A few days after that event, more strange things began to happen in my room. I never found the things where I had left them, and I heard as if they opened the drawer of the furniture that was very heavy for an adult person. On another occasion, while I was sleeping, I thought my brother was the one who was moving it. But when I asked him what he wanted, I pulled it and there was no one. The drawer was only open. After 2 weeks, I decided to change the furniture and put it next to the bed. The noise became present, and tired of not knowing what it was about, I opened my eyes. There I could see how the drawer was moving by itself without any difficulty. I couldn't stand it and I shouted in terror and ran immediately to my mother's place to tell her everything that had happened. At that time, I was addicted to spending the morning on the computer, so on one occasion I finished using it at quite an entrance at night. I walked to the bathroom and passed by where we put the dirty clothes and I saw a big black bag. But when I focused the view, I could no longer see anything. I decided not to take the importance and continued with my routine when for a second I heard the voice of a girl tarareando a song. My skin turned into a hen and I ran to my parents' room to spend the night. I don't know what it was for, but in that case many paranormal activities happened. From ghosts to elves, witches and fairies. One morning while we were having breakfast I saw my dog Labrador in the garden following a movement with his head. When I looked closely at the view, I saw that it was two small beings of approximately 15 centimeters. They were covered with leaves and moved around the garden. With amazement, I was able to detail that they had human legs and arms, but on a smaller scale. Among the encounters that I looked at, they were witches. It happened at dawn and the barks of all the dogs in the neighborhood woke me up. Also included my dog, who slept in the room with me. She was growling hard at the garden door. By then, my mom was sleeping with me and I started to feel uncomfortable, since I remembered that dogs see things that humans cannot. Nervous and scared, I yelled at my dog to keep quiet, but she didn't stop growling. My mother had heard me and sent me to be silent and put me to pray. I prayed to Saint Michael the Archangel, and when I was in the middle of the plow, I heard some heartbreaking screams from a woman. We both jumped down from the bed and the scream was heard again in the darkness of the night. My mom decided to stay awake while I slept and the sound was repeated several times during the night. The curious thing about this is that by that time it was 2005. San Pedro Garza Garcia era el municipio más seguro de Mexico. Así que no era posible que se tratara de algún crimen que se estaba cometiendo. Noches posteriores. Todos mis hermanos salieron y mi madre se había acostado temprano mientras yo permanecía despierta. En eso escuché como abrían la puerta de los armarios de la habitación de mis hermanos. Con curiosidad me asumí a ver que sucedía, pero no había nada. When I came back, the sound occurred again, so I decided to peek into the room through the garden. But 15 minutes passed and nothing happened, so I went to sleep. The next morning I heard as if my mother was calling me by my name. But as I was watching TV, I asked her loudly what she wanted. I did not get a response and she called me again 5 minutes later and I answered her again. But she didn't tell me anything else, so I got up and went to where she was and arrived in a short time, just to see how a hand closed the kitchen door. Believing it was my mother, I followed her and when I entered I saw a white cloth around the floor moving strongly. Only when I turned on the light I didn't see anyone. I looked around and it was empty. Scared, I went to my mother's room and found her sleeping. So I hurried back to my bedroom and when I got there I heard a dry knock. It was as if something had fallen into the house, but I never knew what it was. Years later there was a season where I was sitting with the light off in the room and I could see black bulges moving in the dark. So I decided to sleep with the TV on all night. I saw it with the volume down and on one occasion after lowering the volume to the device, I heard some claws scratching my bed underneath. I thought they were the cats from the house, although it seemed strange to me, since I slept with my puppies and they would have taken them out. I looked up to throw them myself, but there was nothing. Again, I settled down to sleep, but the sound persisted, although I decided to ignore it. It was as if at that moment I felt that the bed shook my feet as if someone had sat down. Scared, I picked up my legs, fearing that it was something normal, and I tried to think that it was a product of my imagination. Until, at some point or another, I felt the part of the mattress that was in front of my face sink in and I heard a woman's laugh inside the room. As an act of defense, I threw the pillow towards where I heard the laugh coming from and ran to my mother. But as I was sleeping, I decided not to wake her up and go back to the bedroom. When I entered, I turned up the volume of the TV so I wouldn't hear the creature again. Sometime later, I found out that my sister-in-law fell asleep one day in my room and the same thing happened to her. They also sat her down in bed and I had heard some laughs. Everything I experienced in that house marked my spiritual sensitivity for life. Meses después de que mi padre falleciera me encontraba paseando con mi pareja cerca de la casa. Cuando iba a mitad del camino él me dice que acababa de ver a mi padre y al voltearlo observó venir de la misma dirección que nosotros. Pasó a nuestro lado y al seguir el rastro no vimos a nadie. Mantengo la creencia de que el sector alberga todas las energías de lo que ha pasado allí. Nuestra casa se vendió y hoy en día es propiedad de nuestros vecinos de enfrente. Although I ignore if strange things continue to happen in the house. These are some of the stories that we lived together in that property. But ourselves, our memories remain many more. The story that I am going to tell was the lesson that I learned that continued to happen to one of my friends. I was born with the ability to feel and see things, as well as the intentions of people and if they are good or bad. 3 years ago I talked to a girl and everything was going really well. Until I discovered that her mother was a witch. The first time I visited her house I felt a heavy energy and I liked to breathe. It was as if the house had eyes everywhere. I tried not to pay attention, but it was inevitable to experience the hostility of the place when we decided to have a meeting, the two of us, and I stayed in the site. When the night turned off all the lights, I felt a desperation that did not let me sleep. With fear, I got up to close the door, but when I tried, the door did not fit with the frame. This would open as if something did not want to let it close. The next morning, when I prepared breakfast, I took the sugar to give it a good taste. For some strange coincidence, the food ended up being extremely salty and we couldn't eat it. I felt that something was telling me that I didn't love you here, so I left as fast as I could. The next day I told my friend about what had happened. She just kept quiet and with time we began to move away and we didn't talk badly about the topic. Until one day I had a very disturbing dream in which she was in danger because a tiger was chasing her tirelessly. In the dream I tried to protect her and a soft voice whispered to me that she was only able to help her. And that I would not leave her because she was very scared. I commented on the dream I had and asked her if she had had problems with someone or wanted to hurt her. Ella lo nego todo y la expliqué que la ensoñación presentía que alguien la estaba haciendo un trabajo de brujería. Sé que alguien la está haciendo mucho daño a ella y a su hija. La niña tiene 11 años y siempre ha sido muy delgada a pesar de que come mucho. Pero esta nunca se llena y tampoco engorda. Al mismo tiempo tiene actitudes incorrectas y le gusta meterse en las vidas ajenas, dándole muchos problemas a su madre. She says that an abuse in her head forces her to do what she dreams of with strange creatures. Once she made a drawing of me and when I investigated the morphology I found that they were demons. As much as I want to help her, her grandmother is a very powerful witch and it is dangerous that she entrusts me. Since although I fully trust God, I know that witches are capable of low and macabre things. To this day, my friend has not been able to be happy with anyone. She, her daughter, is always so sick that she acts under the influence of her mother. Once she told me that her mother was a painter and the only paintings she makes are of inanimate objects with very real faces. Like one of the sun with eyes with which I crossed one day and looking at it fixedly I saw how it appeared and disappeared in some gigantic fangs. She always paints goats with horns, bodies with human appearance and very macabre drawings. Son muchas las experiencias que mi amiga me ha contado de cuando era niña. Me dijo que su madre tenía una máscara en su casa y que todos los días cambiaba de forma. Y que en una ocasión aquel objeto diabólico intentó lanzarla por una ventana. Me ha mostrado libros extraños con rituals y textos macabros. Ella ha intentado salir adelante sola, pero cada vez que lo intenta suceden circunstancias que la hacen volver a casa de su madre. Once, he found the lady lying on the floor unable to get up. He said her legs and hips hurt. They detected that she suffered from arthritis and almost had no hair and didn't like to go out on the street without a hat. Her feet are very big and she uses tight shoes that deform as if they didn't have the shape of a human foot. Lo que más me duele es la hija de mi amiga. Ella ha estado creciendo en ese ambiente tan insano y hostil. Pido una oración por ella y si alguien ha sufrido alguna situación parecida le envío mis bendiciones. I have decided to keep anonymity because when this kind of thing happens to you in a closed mentality environment, it is difficult to overcome it because I assure you that they will point you as a crazy liar. I want to tell my story because everyone should know how dangerous that place is so that they avoid traveling there at dawn. I am from a community in the state of Zacatecas called Estancia de Animas. And what I lived happened on December 13, 2019. There is a small party that is celebrated in a neighboring town called Villa Gonzalez Ortega. So on December 12th night, some friends and I moved to the villa to have a good time and get distracted. The party went smoothly and at dawn I met a young woman for whom I separated from the group. I stayed to see them like that of 1 in the morning on the road to go together. I got distracted and arrived at the place of the meeting an hour after the putada. Just to realize that my friend had left, leaving me alone and without money to go. I couldn't make a call to ask someone to go for me and that the path that I had to walk between Villa and where I live is around 9 kilometers. So the only option I had was to walk again. The night was cold and clear and my plan was to walk down the road with the hope that a car would stop to give me a ride. I walked for a long time and never decelerated the step. The moment I was halfway down the road I started to notice. A rather strange smell permeated the air. It was like the corpse of an animal in a state of rot. The smell was so intense that it gave me nausea and a strong urge to vomit. As I continued down the road, the smell became unbearable, and I prayed to get home soon. Suddenly, a whirlwind of earth in the distance caught my attention. The dust rose beside the road, some distance ahead. As I got closer, I thought it might be an animal stuck on a wire fence. But when I reached the spot where the dust was, the movement stopped completely. I took out my phone to use the flashlight, and my body froze when I saw what it was. It was a woman who, at first glance, looked as though half of her body was buried. She wore a black dress and had extremely long hair. Then I noticed that she was rolling on the ground, which was causing the cloud of dust. Despite being scared, I slowly approached her to ask if she was okay. But this woman only inhaled and exhaled in a furious way, producing gasping sounds. I didn't know if I should leave her or help her, especially after realizing that the disgusting smell came from her. When I asked again if she needed help, the woman raised a very long hand with giant, pointed nails. They were black, like those of a wild animal. I felt my legs losing strength, and I could barely stand. With her claw, she pointed toward my town, and with a voice that sounded like a pig mixed with that of a woman, she told me to leave. Scared, I turned and began to run. I don't know how long I ran because it felt like no time at all before fatigue stopped me. I had reached the cattle guard. I stopped to breathe, fear coursing through my body, and then kept walking at a fast pace. Suddenly, I felt the disgusting smell again. Instinctively, I turned to see the apparition only 10 meters away, following me. My heart pumped fast, and I started to lose my senses. At that moment, I realized it was a witch. Her hair was full of dirt, and her arms were longer than those of a normal person. Her face was terrifying, she had no eyes, and her mouth was abnormally large. She floated in the dark night, revealing that she only had half of her body. The rest was just black rags knotted at her waist. I ran with what little strength I had left, while the witch followed at the same distance. I was jumping and screaming like an animal in pain. I fought to get away, but my legs wouldn't carry me any further, and the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe came to mind. I started to pray, asking for help without turning around, and I shouted to get away in the name of the Virgin. The creature began to cry and turned around, the sound echoing in the darkness. The image of that witch convulsing and letting go is something I will never forget. I continued to call on the Virgin in a loud voice until the monster moved away, floating toward the mountain. Her laughter was heard in the distance and then disappeared completely. I continued walking until I got home, fearing she might appear again. That encounter on the road proved to me that witches exist and that it is dangerous to walk at dawn along that road. In Zacatecas, there are many witches. From a very young age, the paranormal has caught my attention. My mother always told me stories from her childhood about encounters with these types of beings. But 6 years ago, I verified with my own eyes that there is something else in this world that lives among us. It was October 2014 when I had a terrible argument with my parents because I was making bad choices. They found out my situation was getting worse and talked to me to try to prevent it from getting worse. I remained silent throughout the conversation until they were both asleep. In the darkness of the cold night, I left the house without saying anything. I walked to the house of my friend Saul, whom I had known since childhood and who had encouraged me to continue with that insane life. Without having anywhere to go, I went with him to find solace. Saul didn't live with his family, and I found him where he spent most of his time. When I shouted his name, he came to meet me, and I explained my situation. Without thinking twice, he offered me a place to live, and said goodbye to the group he was with to drive me home. On the way, I noticed that we were moving far from the center. We passed a channel of black waters that scared me because it looked like a ravine. I ignored my feelings, and we kept walking for a long time. When I asked Saul if we had much further to go, he told me we were close. But the place was not a great house and had no luxury. I lived with a man with alcohol problems, and it was like being alone most of the time. At that moment, I remembered a story from my mother that witches always bothered people with drinking problems. The thought gave me goosebumps as I observed the place where I was going to stay. It was a house in disrepair, with trash everywhere. Inside, I saw an older man with a disheveled appearance, with long nails and a long beard. Saul introduced him as Don Chewy and told him that I would now be living there. However, the man was so drunk that he didn't even pay attention to me. My friend and I talked about what had happened and how scared I was to be put in such a place. When Don came, Don Chewy came to me to ask for some coins. I gave him what I had, and he said he would leave quickly before the witches arrived. His expression and tone of voice sent a chill through my whole body, giving me goosebumps. After a while, the man came back and sat quietly, warning me not to go out because the witches were about to arrive and that if they saw me, it could go badly for me. Laughing, I told him not to worry about me and that I would be fine. But the doubt remained in my mind and made me ask if there were really witches in that place. Drinking from his bottle, he answered that the best thing was to be careful because on several occasions when he was alone, they tried to drag him away. Seeing the fear with which he was talking about the topic began to make me scared, but I dismissed it for the moment. Days passed, and on one occasion, I wanted to go out in the early morning. I remembered what Don Chewy had said, but again, I dismissed it. I approached the door, and the man stopped me before I left and told me not to because they were already outside. Ignoring the warnings, I went to the car, finding myself in a sepulchral silence. I felt a cold breeze that scratched my whole body, and when I tried to keep moving, I turned a corner and bumped into an old woman wearing a dark cape. Meeting that creature left me speechless, and I froze in my tracks. I couldn't escape, and a decrepit hand appeared to grab me. I could see that it was like that of a wrinkled bird with very long nails. An intense tingling filled my body as she slowly turned her face to look me in the eyes. Seeing her face was like seeing a demon itself. I don't know where I got the strength to run home, about to lose consciousness. When I entered, Saul asked what had happened, but I was too scared to answer. Don Chewy responded that it had been the witches. At that moment, the old man took out a bag of powders and drew a cross with them at the entrance. And with a crutch in his hand, he began to say nonsense to keep them away. Don Chewy assured us that they would not enter the house and placed circles of salt and cinnamon around the beds. That night, I couldn't sleep, thinking about the apparition I had seen. I felt that they were still outside, waiting and laughing and talking to others like her. It has been the biggest fear I have experienced in my entire life. After 6 years, I still can't forget her face. I also started a place where they helped me overcome the path I was going down. I confirmed for myself that what my mother said was true and that only if things go well for you, you will go well in life. My experience in the world of magic and the paranormal begins from before I was born because my great-grandmother was one of the most important healers in the city. She worked with black and white magic, making it common to see her come out transformed at night. It was said that the witches around her were angry and that she kept out of their way, trying not to collide with any. I think the gift I have was inherited from my family. My first experience with this world happened when I was 15 years old. At that time, I was in preparatory school, and one day before Easter, I saw a terrifying event at about 3:20 in the morning. I was sleeping in my bed when I felt as if someone was sitting on my back. My knowledge of the subject was quite extensive, but I had never experienced anything on my own. After that, the bed sank, and I couldn't move anymore. My throat froze, and I had no control over any of my limbs. All I could do was move my eyes. I felt a great weight on my body that pressed me against the mattress, and a few seconds later, the face of a person rubbed against mine. Consumed by fear, I felt my body running out of energy until I fell asleep again. But then I heard someone shouting, "Help me! Help me find Eric." I didn't know anyone with that name. When I heard it, I felt like I was vanishing, followed by being pushed out of my bed. When I reacted, I ran to my parents' room, and the next day, we went to visit Grandma. She wasn't a healer, but she had knowledge of that world and did family work. My grandmother was the same. That date remained marked in my mind, and when the year was fulfilled, I was afraid the event would repeat itself. That night, I didn't have the same appearance, but I dreamed that I was in a completely dark room. The door was giant and red and had a grid at the top. I saw that I was being tormented. It was a long-haired man who asked me to help him open the door. Before opening it, I woke up in my room, but that poor man was asking for help. At that moment, I fell asleep from fright, and I don't remember anything else that happened. I still don't understand what it was about, and my grandmother says that maybe I inherited the ability from my great-grandmother to make astral travels and that the entity could contact me that way. However, I still have no answer as to who that man is. My story happened about 13 years ago. My older son was still a baby, and we lived in a small, 2-story house. The place was cozy, but before we moved in, it had been empty for a long time. On the lower floor, there was a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and patio. Meanwhile, on the second floor, there was only the main bedroom and a bathroom outside the room. The staircase that connected the floors was right in front of the bedroom door, so it was easy to see from the bed who was going up the stairs. We used to sleep upstairs, my husband and I in bed and the baby in his crib with us. During the night, I left the lamp on to be able to attend to my son when I needed it. One night, after getting ready for bed, I closed the door of my room to avoid feeling cold in the morning. And, as always, I left the light on the staircase to avoid any accident. I turned on the television and fell asleep immediately. Hours passed, and when I woke up, I turned to the crib to check that everything was under control. However, I was terrified by what I saw. There was a being the size of a child, but with a wrinkled face and green skin hanging over the crib. It had very dirty and torn clothes, but the most frightening thing was the nauseating smell. My body did not react and was petrified when I saw that monster near my baby's crib. I opened and closed my eyes, hoping that the image would disappear, but it didn't work. The being continued there, looking at me with a twisted smile. I realized that the door I had secured before I went to bed was completely open. Even the light from the corridor was coming from my room, outlining the figure of that scary being. I was paralyzed and couldn't move or say a word. It was then that the creature stretched its disgusting hands to the crib of my baby and, with a sinister voice, said to me, "Do you want me to wake him up?" Tears ran down my cheeks because of the powerlessness I felt. I shook my head, tried to wake my husband without success, and, enjoying my pain, the witch began to shake the cradle. My son woke up, and I gathered strength from where I didn't seem to have any. I managed to push my husband, making him wake up. He sat up with a start, and I screamed as loudly as I could that someone had entered the house. The creature opened its eyes in surprise and let go of the cradle when my husband got up. The witch ran out of the room and fell down the stairs, making a lot of noise. My husband went down and turned on all the lights, checking every corner of the house. Meanwhile, I took my son in my arms and saw a viscous and disgusting stain that the monster had left where it had its hand on the cradle. My husband returned to the room without finding anything suspicious, but he told me that he had clearly heard someone falling down the stairs. From that night on, I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours in a row. We securely closed our room and put a piece of furniture blocking the entrance. The baby slept with us in bed until the month we could move from that house. It has certainly been the biggest horror we have lived through. This happened to me when I was 20 years old. My cousin and I were talking this afternoon in the living room, when we realized the clock was marking 3 a.m. But since we were already awake for a while, we decided to continue talking a little more. Suddenly, we heard the sound of some heels falling from the ceiling to the floor. At that moment, we were silent because, in the Magdalena Contreras County, there is a rumor that if you hear heels or a turkey, don't go out because it's a witch. Knowing this, we were curious to discover if what they said was true. So, we went out to see what we had heard. Once we got to the patio, we saw the silhouette of a woman in the neighbor's house with a very strange face and a hunched back. We were both scared because, just that afternoon, my cousin had told me that there was a baby in that house. When a baby is born in the town, the witches appear, since there is a nearby forest where people used to relax. But at night, it is said that if you look out the windows, you can see fireballs flying between the trees, giving a perfect idea of the beings that inhabit that place. Our bodies were frozen by the fear of proving that the stories were true. We watched as the witch tried to get through the window. After a few minutes without being able to move, a blow hit the back of the duck. It was like a fist that hit the floor, and the sound helped us react immediately. When we ran out, apparently, we caught the creature's attention. When we entered, we heard how she scratched the door with long nails and laughed from the outside. We hid under the sheets, but we had a strange feeling that they were watching us. The seconds passed very slowly, and after several hours of knowing that the witch was outside, we heard how she slowly climbed up and left, leaving us in peace. The next day, The neighbors commented that they had heard and seen the witch the night before and that she was probably coming for the neighbor's baby. We were speechless because that day was no coincidence. The creature couldn't take the baby, perhaps because our curiosity distracted it. But that could have cost us dearly. My recommendation is that if you hear any strange sound that is not common, don't peek, because you might not run as lucky as us and may not have the opportunity to tell it.